The first time Sarah saw Mark, she didn't think husband. She thought dangerous. Not the bad kind. No leather jacket, no cigarette smile. Dangerous like a cliff edge on a bright day, like you could step closer just to feel the pull. It was late September on a campus that smelled like cut grass and coffee and that first cold snap that makes everyone pretend they're tougher than they are. Sarah had a tote bag full of used textbooks biting into her shoulder. She was already late for a psych lecture she'd promised herself she wouldn't skip, because she'd promised herself a lot of things after her mom cried through a divorce that nobody talked about in public. Mark was outside the student union, sitting on a bench like it belonged to him, one leg crossed over the other, tapping a pencil on a notebook as if ideas were rude for arriving too slowly. He looked up when Sarah passed, not in the casual way people glance at strangers, but like he'd been waiting for her without knowing it. She did that thing people do when they feel seen. She looked away, then back to confirm it was real. He smiled like he'd caught her. "Hey," he said as if they'd already met. "You're going to break your shoulder with that bag." Sarah stopped because she couldn't help it. "And you're going to break your hand tapping that pencil." He glanced down at his notebook and shrugged. "Occupational hazard." "What occupation?" "Trying to figure out my life before my loans do it for me." He held the notebook up a little, like a peace offering. On the page was a half-drawn diagram of something. Arrows, boxes, a couple of words crossed out. "I'm Mark." She almost lied. She had the instinct to keep herself private, to be careful, to not do what her mother did. Fall fast, fall hard, then spend years sweeping up the pieces. But there was something about Mark that made caution feel like a coat you could shrug off for just 1 minute. "Sarah," she said. "Sarah," he repeated like he was tasting it. "You look like someone who's doing everything the hard way." "I'm just carrying books." "No." He tilted his head. "You're carrying everything." She laughed, one sharp little laugh that surprised her because it was real. "Wow. That's either very insightful or very annoying." "Give it time," he said. "I can be both." He walked her to her lecture, and the whole time Sarah felt like she was in a movie where the soundtrack knows something the characters don't. Mark asked about her major, her hometown, whether she liked diner coffee or the fancy stuff that tastes like burnt hope. He told her he was studying business because it was practical, but he wanted to write, and saying it out loud made him look embarrassed, like it was too soft to be true. At the building entrance, Sarah paused with her hand on the door. "So," Mark said, a little too casual, like he'd practiced it in his head. "There's a place off campus. Real diner, vinyl booths, pie that'll make you believe in God for 15 minutes. Sarah hesitated just long enough to feel the risk. "I have class," she said. "After," he replied instantly. "And homework." "Bring it. I'll pretend I'm useful." She should have said no. She should have done the smart thing. Instead, she nodded, because something in her had been starving and Mark looked like a full meal. That evening, the diner smelled like bacon grease and cinnamon and somebody's cheap cologne. The waitress called everyone Han, like she'd signed a contract to mother the whole county. Mark slid into the booth across from Sarah and pushed the sugar caddy aside like he was clearing a space for them. He watched her read the menu like he was watching a magic trick. "What?" she asked, self-conscious. "You're serious," he said. "About everything. I like it." Sarah rolled her eyes. "You like a lot of things." "True." He leaned in. "But I don't get distracted easy." She believed him. That was the problem. The sweet, deadly problem. When Sarah finally got up to leave, Mark walked her to her car. The parking lot was dim and cold, and the air had that metallic bite like winter practicing its entrance. Mark lingered by her door, hands shoved in his pockets. "I'm going to see you again," he said. It wasn't a question. Sarah's heart did something stupid. "That's a bold assumption." He smiled, softer now. "It's not an assumption. It's a decision." She laughed again, but it came out thin. You can't decide for me." Mark's eyes stayed on hers. "Then tell me no." Sarah opened her mouth and felt the word no sit there like a stone she couldn't lift. Instead, she said, "Okay, one more time." Mark nodded like he'd won something fair. "Good." And that was the first step. Not the wedding, not the house, not the kids. The first step was the moment Sarah let herself believe that being chosen meant being safe. Love, when it's new, is a kind of construction project. You build a world out of inside jokes and late-night drives and the way your phone lights up and suddenly nothing else matters. Sarah and Mark built theirs fast. They graduated. They moved to a mid-sized town where the streets had names like Maple and Oak, like somebody had planned the whole place to sound wholesome. Mark got a job that came with a badge and a parking space and a salary that made his parents finally stop asking if he was still writing. Sarah found work in a counseling office and told herself it mattered. They were good. They were busy. They were the kind of couple people looked at and thought, "They've got it figured out." Mark proposed in a way that was equal parts cheesy and perfect. A ring in a little box, yes, but also a speech that made Sarah's throat tighten. "I don't want a life that doesn't have you in it," he said. "I want the boring stuff. I want grocery lists and dentist appointments. I want to be the person you call when something breaks." Sarah cried and laughed at the same time and said yes because it felt like the only sane option. Their wedding was in late spring, when everything smelled like wet earth and hope. The reception had string lights and a DJ who played every predictable song, and Sarah didn't care. Mark spun her around on the dance floor like they were the only two people in the room. Later, in the hotel, Mark traced her knuckles and whispered, "We did it." "Did what?" Sarah asked, half asleep. "Got out," he said. "Made something." Sarah smiled into his shoulder. She wanted to believe that made something meant made something permanent. They bought a house a year later, the kind with beige siding and a little porch and a backyard that promised future barbecues. The realtor talked about good school districts, like it was a love language. Sarah walked through the empty rooms and imagined furniture, laughter, a Christmas tree in the corner by the window. Mark stood in the doorway of the kitchen, hands on his hips, and said, "I can see it." "See what?" Sarah asked. "Our life," Mark said, and he sounded certain, like certainty was a muscle he'd trained. They painted walls on weekends, ate pizza on the floor because they didn't have a table yet, and fell asleep exhausted in the middle of half-unpacked boxes. Their friends came over and brought housewarming gifts, a cutting board, a set of wine glasses, a doormat that said "Home Sweet Home" like it was a warning. The first 4th of July in that house smelled like charcoal and sweet corn and sunscreen. Mark manned the grill like it was a throne. Sarah stood nearby with a bowl of potato salad, laughing too loud, making sure everyone had enough because she was good at hosting and even better at performing happiness. "You two are adorable," their neighbor, Linda, called over the fence. "Keeping up with the Joneses already." Mark lifted his beer. "We are the Joneses," he joked, and everyone laughed. Sarah watched him, sunlight on his face, the ease of his smile, and felt a warm ache in her chest. She thought, "This is it. This is what people mean by the dream." Then came the kids. First, Emma, small, furious, perfect. Sarah cried in the hospital bed, sweaty and trembling, while Mark held their daughter like she was made of glass. "I can't believe she's real," he whispered. Sarah reached for him with shaking fingers. "She's real. We're real." Mark kissed Sarah's forehead. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. 2 years later came Noah, quieter than Emma with Mark's eyes and Sarah's stubborn chin. The house filled up with plastic toys and tiny socks and the constant low hum of responsibility. Sarah learned how to function on 4 hours of sleep. Mark learned how to warm bottles at 3 a.m. and still show up to work like he wasn't unraveling. They took family photos in matching outfits. They hosted backyard BBQs where Mark flipped burgers and talked about promotions while Sarah chased toddlers with wet wipes. They posted smiling pictures online because that's what people do. Proof of life, proof of joy. At night, when the kids finally slept, Sarah and Mark would sit on the couch, shoulders touching, eyes on the TV but minds somewhere else. "Can you believe we did this?" Sarah would whisper. Mark would exhale and squeeze her hand. "Yeah," he'd say. "We're doing it." Sometimes Sarah would watch Mark's face in the flickering light and feel the tiniest pinch of fear. Don't lose this, and she'd push it away like a bad thought. Because the fall always starts when you think you're too high to hit the ground. The first crack wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself with screaming or shattered glass. It arrived the way rot arrives, quietly, while everything still looks fine. It was a Tuesday. The kind that blends into every other Tuesday, except that Sarah would remember it later with weird clarity. The hum of the fridge, the smell of dish soap, Mark's shoes by the door like punctuation. Mark came home later than usual. Not late, but late enough that dinner had gone cold and Sarah had reheated her own plate twice and then stopped eating altogether. When he walked in, his tie loosened and his phone still in his hand, Sarah heard the tiny sound of a message notification. Just one chirp. Then silence. "Hey," Mark said, distracted. He kissed her cheek, but it was a quick brush like checking a box. "Hey," Sarah replied, and the word came out flat. Mark opened the fridge and stared in like he expected answers inside. "Sorry, meeting ran long." Sarah wiped her hands on a towel that was already damp. "You said you'd be home by 6. Mark didn't look at her. "I know." Emma's voice floated from the living room. "Daddy?" Mark softened instantly. "Hey, Em." He walked in, scooped her up, and Sarah watched him transform. Smile, warmth, patience. It was like watching a man put on a costume he didn't realize he was wearing. When Mark came back to the kitchen, Sarah said carefully, "You didn't call." Mark blinked like he'd forgotten she existed for a second. "I was busy." "I was waiting," Sarah said, and she hated how small it sounded. Mark's jaw tightened. "Sarah, I'm doing this for us." That sentence, "for us," landed like a paper cut. Small, but sharp. "You're doing it for your job," she said. Mark laughed once without humor. "Oh, come on." "I'm not trying to fight," Sarah insisted, voice low because the kids could hear everything even when they pretended not to. I need you to be here." "I am here," Mark snapped, and then he looked shocked at his own tone. Sarah stared at him, stunned. Mark had never snapped like that before. Not at her. There it was, the elephant in the room, stepping onto the rug, daring them to acknowledge it. Mark exhaled, softer. "I'm tired." "So am I," Sarah said. "I'm tired too." Mark's eyes flicked to his phone on the counter. The screen lit up briefly, another notification. Sarah didn't see the message, just the name at the top. Jenna. Sarah's stomach tightened. "Who's Jenna?" Mark's hand moved fast, flipping the phone face down. Too fast. "She's HR," he said, "for the new project." Sarah didn't know why it mattered, but it did. She heard something in the speed of his answer, the way he avoided her eyes. "Why is HR texting you at night?" Sarah asked. Mark's voice hardened. "Why are you interrogating me?" "I'm not interrogating you," Sarah said, trying to stay calm, trying to be reasonable like she taught clients to be. It's just what?" Mark cut in. "You think I'm cheating? Is that what we're doing now?" Sarah felt heat rise to her face. "I didn't say that." "But you thought it," Mark said, and his certainty made her feel guilty for something she hadn't done yet. Sarah's mouth opened, closed. She could hear the kids in the living room, the cartoon voices bright and oblivious. Mark grabbed a plate from the counter and shoved it into the microwave, punching buttons too hard. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Sarah stared at the back of his head and realized, terrified, that she was suddenly afraid of being seen as needy. She had become the thing women get labeled when they want basic attention. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She did something worse. She swallowed it. "Fine," she said quietly. "Forget it." Mark didn't turn around. "Good." The microwave beeped. Mark pulled out the plate, ate standing up, eyes on his phone again like it was oxygen. Sarah sat at the table and listened to the fork scrape against ceramic. It sounded too loud. Everything sounded too loud. Later that night, Mark climbed into bed and reached for Sarah automatically. His hand found her waist like a habit. Sarah stayed stiff. Mark paused. "Are you mad?" Sarah stared at the ceiling. "No." Mark exhaled, relieved by the lie. "Okay." He fell asleep quickly. Sarah lay awake, counting the seconds between his breaths, and felt the ghost of that Tuesday settle into the corners of the room. Not cheating, not yet, not even hatred. Just the first moment she realized love doesn't die all at once. It gets neglected. The fights didn't start as fights. They started as tone. A sigh when Sarah asked a question. A whatever when Mark didn't want to talk. A text reply that felt like a door closing. Sarah: "Can you pick up milk and diapers?" Mark: "K." Just that. Lowercase. No period, no heart, no sure. It shouldn't have mattered, but it did. It felt like being dismissed with a flick of the wrist. And Sarah, who had spent her life trying to be easy to love, started to become sharp around the edges. It was the Christmas party that made the tension visible to other people. Mark's company rented out a country club that smelled like pine and expensive cologne. Sarah wore a black dress she hadn't worn since before Noah was born. She curled her hair while Mark stood in the doorway, phone in hand, half watching. "You look nice," he said, like he was reading it off a script. "Thanks," Sarah said, and waited for him to say something more. Anything. He didn't. At the party, Mark was suddenly charming. He laughed at jokes. He shook hands. He introduced Sarah like she was an accessory. "This is my wife, Sarah," he said to a group of co-workers. "She's a counselor, keeps the rest of us from going insane." They chuckled. Sarah smiled politely while something bitter coiled in her chest. Then she saw Jenna. Jenna was younger than Sarah by maybe 5 years, with glossy hair and the easy confidence of someone who'd never had spit up on her blouse. She approached Mark like she belonged in his orbit. "Mark," Jenna said brightly, and she touched his arm. Quick, casual, intimate. Mark's face lit up. "Hey, you made it." Sarah watched the exchange the way you watch a slow-motion car accident. Helpless, fascinated, nauseated. Jenna turned to Sarah with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be Sarah. Mark talks about you all the time." Sarah's pulse thudded. "Does he?" "That's sweet," Sarah said, and her voice came out thin. Mark sipped his drink and avoided Sarah's gaze. The whole thing took maybe 30 seconds. But Sarah felt something in herself shift, like a key turning in a lock. On the drive home, Mark hummed along to the radio like nothing had happened. Sarah gripped the door handle with her fingers, nails digging into plastic. "So," she said finally, "Jenna's HR?" Mark glanced at her. "Yeah." "She seems close to you," Sarah said carefully. Mark's laugh was sharp. "Are you kidding me?" "I'm asking," Sarah insisted. "You're accusing," Mark snapped. "You saw her touch my arm and suddenly you're writing a whole soap opera." Sarah's eyes burned. "I'm not writing anything. You just what?" Mark's voice rose. "Want to control who I talk to? Want to audit my phone? Want to stand there and act like I'm some kind of criminal?" "Why are you getting so defensive?" Sarah asked, and the question came out louder than she intended. Mark hit the steering wheel with the heel of his hand. "Because I'm sick of coming home to a damn interrogation every night." Sarah flinched. "Every night?" "Mark, I ask you where you've been because you're never here." "I'm working," Mark said, like he was explaining math to a child. "And I'm raising your kids," Sarah shot back. "Our kids," Mark corrected. Sarah laughed, bitter. "Funny how you remember that when it's convenient." Mark's jaw clenched so hard Sarah saw the muscle twitch. "You know what, Sarah? You don't get it." "Get what?" "The pressure," Mark said, voice thick with anger. "The responsibility. The fact that if I don't perform, we lose everything." Sarah's voice cracked. "We're already losing everything." Mark slammed the car into park in their driveway so hard it jerked them both forward. "Don't," he warned. "Don't what?" Sarah asked, tears spilling now, fury and grief mixing together. "Don't say the quiet part out loud?" Mark got out of the car and walked toward the house without waiting for her. Sarah followed, heels clicking on concrete like gunshots. Inside, the house was dark and still. The stale air held the smell of old dinner and laundry detergent. Sarah flicked on the kitchen light. It felt harsh, exposing. Mark tossed his keys on the counter. They clattered, loud in the silence. Sarah picked them up and held them in her palm, as if she could weigh the marriage with metal. "Do you even like me anymore?" she asked, voice small. Mark stared at her, eyes glassy. For a second he looked like the Mark from the diner. Soft, earnest, terrified. Then the mask slammed back into place. "I love you," he said like a legal statement. "That's not what I asked," Sarah said. Mark's gaze shifted to the vase on the kitchen table. Cheap glass, a gift from Linda next door, holding plastic poinsettias Sarah forgot to throw away. He grabbed it suddenly and hurled it into the sink. The vase exploded. Sarah froze, heart punching against her ribs. Mark stood there breathing hard, hands shaking. He looked horrified, like he didn't recognize himself. The kids stirred upstairs. A tiny voice called, sleepy and scared. "Mom?" Sarah's throat tightened. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Not now. Not with little feet on the stairs. She whispered, "Go back to bed, honey. It's okay." Emma's footsteps retreated. Mark's voice broke. I wasn't." Sarah stared at the broken glass, at the way the shards caught the light like teeth. It wasn't the vase. It was what the act represented. The first time the anger turned physical. The first time the house itself became collateral. Sarah said, very quietly, "You scared me." Mark swallowed. "I'm sorry." Sarah nodded like she accepted it. But inside, something hardened. Because apologies don't unbreak things. After the vase, there were no more explosions. There was something colder. They became experts at passing each other like strangers in their own home. Mark started sleeping in the guest room, because he needed rest. Sarah started folding laundry in silence, moving through the house like a ghost. Dinner became a performance. Sarah would place plates on the table, the fork tines aligned because she needed control somewhere. Emma would chatter about school. Noah would drop peas on the floor and giggle. Mark would scroll his phone with one hand under the table, eyes flicking up only when he had to. Sarah learned what Mark's silence meant. It meant punishment. If she pushed, if she asked about Jenna, about money, about why Mark smelled like a bar at 10 p.m., Mark would withdraw so completely it felt like suffocation. He'd answer with one word, then two, then nothing. Sarah hated herself for how badly she needed him to react. Silence was worse than yelling. Yelling meant he cared enough to engage. Silence meant she wasn't worth the energy. Friends noticed, of course. People always notice, they just pretend they don't. At neighborhood gatherings, Sarah would laugh too loud. Mark would put an arm around her shoulder like a display. "Still going strong?" Linda would ask, bright and nosy. "Never better," Mark would say, smiling. Sarah would feel the lie sit heavy in her mouth like stale bread. One night, Sarah sat on the couch scrolling through photos on her phone. 4th of July smiles, the kids in pumpkin costumes, Mark kissing her cheek at the zoo, and she felt like she was looking at someone else's life. Mark walked in, tossed his briefcase down, and went straight to the fridge. "You're late," Sarah said. She kept her voice neutral, like she was negotiating with a wild animal. Mark didn't turn. "Work." Sarah's fingers tightened around her phone. "I checked our bank account today." Mark paused. Okay. There's a new credit card, Sarah said. In your name. Mark shut the fridge slowly. It's for expenses. What expenses? Sarah asked. Mark turned, eyes cold. Do you want the receipts? Sarah flinched at the sarcasm. I want honesty. Mark laughed softly. You want control? Sarah stood up. I want to know where our money is going. Our money, Mark repeated, and it sounded like mockery now. Funny. You didn't say our money when you bought that stupid stroller. Sarah's mouth fell open. That stroller was for Noah. And the therapist you keep seeing? Mark shot back. What's that for? To learn how to hate me with professional language? Sarah felt her face go hot. Don't do that. Don't do what? Mark asked, stepping closer. His voice was low, controlled. Call me the villain while you play the martyr. Sarah's chest rose and fell quickly. She could smell him. Alcohol faintly mixed with mint gum. He'd been drinking. Not drunk, not sloppy. Just enough. The elephant in the room, Sarah whispered, and she didn't mean money anymore. Mark's eyes narrowed. Say it. Sarah's voice trembled. Are you sleeping with her? Mark stared at Sarah for a long moment. In that pause, Sarah felt the whole marriage balanced on a pin. Then Mark smiled. Slow. Cruel. You really want me to be, don't you? Sarah's stomach dropped. What? You want to be right, Mark said. You want a reason. Because if you can blame me, you don't have to look at yourself. Sarah's eyes filled. Look at myself for what? For begging my husband to come home? Mark stepped back, shaking his head like she was pathetic. God, Sarah, you're exhausting. That word, exhausting, hit harder than the broken vase. It wasn't anger. It was contempt. Sarah's voice turned very calm. Okay. Mark blinked, thrown. Okay, what? Sarah swallowed. Okay, if I'm exhausting, stop coming home. Mark's face tightened. Don't threaten me. I'm not threatening you, Sarah said. I'm stating facts. Mark stared at her like he'd never seen her before. Then he grabbed his keys, the same keys that used to mean safety, and walked out. The door closed with a soft click. Sarah stood in the kitchen, alone, and listened to the silence swell. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Upstairs, Noah coughed in his sleep. Sarah slid down the cabinet and sat on the floor, back against the wood, arms wrapped around herself like she could hold her own pieces in. Her phone buzzed. A text from Mark. Mark, don't wait up. No apology, no explanation. Just another door closing. In the weeks that followed, the Cold War spread to their social circle. Mark told his friends Sarah was stressed and overreacting. Sarah told her sister Mark was checked out. Every story had a slant. Every conversation was a recruiting pitch. Even the kids became terrain. Tell Daddy good night, Sarah would say. Emma would glance at Mark, unsure, and whisper, Good night. Mark would respond with forced cheer, Night, Em. And Sarah would see it. How quickly children learn to read the weather in a room. Therapy was suggested, attempted, weaponized. In the counselor's office, Mark sat stiff, arms crossed, polite as hell. I just want peace, Mark said. Sarah wanted to scream. Peace? You want silence, not peace. Instead, she said, I want partnership. Mark looked at her like she was speaking another language. On the drive home, Mark said, See? Even the therapist thinks you need to calm down. Sarah stared out the window and realized they weren't fighting to fix the marriage anymore. They were fighting to win the story. Divorce doesn't start with papers. It starts with logistics. It starts with Sarah opening a new checking account in her name only, hands shaking as she types her Social Security number into a bank website at midnight. It starts with Mark changing the password on the family laptop. It starts with quiet, petty moves that feel childish until you realize their survival. Sarah met her attorney in a small office that smelled like old carpet and coffee that had been reheated too many times. The lawyer, Janet, was a woman in her 50s with a voice like sandpaper and eyes that missed nothing. "Tell me what you want," Janet said. Sarah laughed once, hollow. "I want my life back." Janet nodded, like she'd heard it 1,000 times. "Okay. Legally, we talk about custody, support, and division of assets. Emotionally, you can want whatever you want, but we deal in facts." Facts. Sarah clung to the word like a railing. They listed everything: the house, the cars, the joint savings, Mark's 401k, Sarah's smaller retirement account, the credit cards, the kids' college fund that felt like a cruel joke now. "And the dog," Sarah added, voice breaking. Janet blinked. "You have a dog?" "Buddy," Sarah said. "Mark wants him." Janet sighed. "Of course he does." When Mark got served, he didn't explode. He went quiet in that controlled way that always meant danger. He held the papers in his hand at the kitchen counter, reading them like they were a bad performance review. "So, this is it," Mark said. Sarah stood across from him, hands clenched. "Yes." Mark looked up, eyes sharp. "You're really doing this?" Sarah's voice trembled. "You left a long time ago. I'm just making it official." Mark's laugh was soft and mean. "You think you're going to take my house? My kids? Half my retirement?" "Our house," Sarah corrected, and her voice surprised her with its strength. "Our kids. And yes, half, because that's how this works." Mark's nostrils flared. "You didn't earn my retirement." Sarah's eyes stung. "I earned it by holding our life together while you disappeared." Mark stepped closer. "You're gonna regret this." Sarah didn't back up. "I already regret not doing it sooner." Temporary orders came first. Who stays in the house? Who pays what bills? How the kids' schedule works until the court decides something longer term. It was paperwork and calendars and the strange humiliation of listing your life as line items. In mediation, Sarah and Mark sat across from each other in a conference room with a bowl of cheap mints in the middle like a peace offering. The mediator, Tom, spoke gently, like everyone in the room might shatter. "We're here to find a settlement," Tom said. "Nobody gets everything they want. The goal is fairness and stability, especially for the children." Mark smiled without warmth. "I want 50-50 custody." Sarah's chest tightened. "You're never here?" Mark's eyes flashed. "I'm here now." Sarah heard the subtext. "Now that it's a fight, I'll show up." They argued over pickup times like those minutes contained their entire identities. They argued over holidays: who gets Christmas Eve, who gets Thanksgiving, how to alternate 4th of July when fireworks were now a trigger. They argued over the house. Sarah wanted to keep it because it was the only home the kids remembered. Mark wanted to sell because he didn't want Sarah living inside the symbol of his success. "You can't afford it on your salary," Mark said in mediation, voice calm but pointed. Sarah stared at him. "I can, with child support and with refinancing." Janet ran the numbers. Mark scoffed. "So I'm going to fund your little single mom fantasy?" Sarah's hands trembled under the table. "You're going to support your children. That's not a fantasy." The mediator cleared his throat. "Mark, let's keep it respectful." Mark leaned back, eyes hard. "I'm being respectful." Discovery was worse. Bank statements, credit card records, retirement statements, the forensic part of divorce where love gets translated into spreadsheets. And then, in a stack of credit card charges, Sarah saw it. Hotel rooms, weekend dates, a restaurant she and Mark used to go to on anniversaries. Jenna's name wasn't on the statement, but the pattern was. Sarah stared at the paper until the numbers blurred. The betrayal wasn't even shocking anymore. It was just confirmation, like seeing smoke and finally admitting there's a fire. When Sarah confronted Mark, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, and that made it uglier. She laid the printed statement on the counter. Mark looked down, then up. His face didn't change. "What is this?" Sarah asked. Mark exhaled through his nose. "You went through my statements." "Our statements," Sarah said, voice flat. Mark shrugged. "So what?" Sarah blinked. "So what?" Mark's eyes finally showed something. Annoyance. "This is why we're getting divorced. Because you can't let anything go." Sarah felt her breath catch. "Did you sleep with her?" Mark stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Does it matter?" Sarah laughed, one broken sound. "It mattered when you made me feel crazy for asking." Mark's jaw tightened. "I'm not doing this right now." Sarah's voice rose for the first time in weeks. "You already did it, Mark. You did it every time you told me I was exhausting, every time you came home late and called it for us." Mark stepped toward her, eyes cold. "You pushed me away." Sarah shook her head, tears spilling. "No. You left, and you blamed me for the empty room." Mark turned, grabbed his coat, and walked out. And Sarah realized, even with proof, even with truth, there would never be the moment where Mark said, "I'm sorry, I hurt you." There would only be the endless shifting of blame like furniture in a dark house. The final negotiations came down to math, a qualified domestic relations order to split the 401k, a decision about who keeps which car, a clause about health insurance for the kids, a plan for shared expenses, school supplies, soccer fees, doctor copays, because even after love dies, the bills don't. And Buddy, the dog, became a weird symbol of everything tender they couldn't share anymore. "I want Buddy," Mark said in mediation, stubborn. Sarah stared. "Buddy sleeps at Emma's feet." Mark's eyes narrowed. "So, I love the dog too." Sarah's voice turned icy. "Then love him enough not to rip him away from the kids." Mark's lips pressed together. He looked away. In the end, Sarah kept the house and the dog, but she had to refinance. Mark kept more of his retirement in exchange. It felt like trading pieces of a life for permission to continue living it. When the judge signed the final decree, it was anticlimactic. No thunder, no soundtrack. Just a stamp, a signature, a clerk calling the next case. Sarah walked out of the courthouse into bright sunlight and felt oddly weightless, like grief had finally become something she could carry without collapsing. Mark walked a few feet behind her, already texting someone. Sarah didn't look. The first night alone in the house, Sarah couldn't sleep. Not because she missed Mark, though some part of her missed the version of him she'd loved, but because silence had changed meaning. Before, silence was punishment. Now, silence was space. She walked through the living room with only the hall light on, the house smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and something older, years of dinners, birthdays, ordinary mornings. She stood by the window and watched the street. A neighbor's porch light flicked on and off. Somewhere, a car door shut. Life kept moving like nothing had happened. Sarah went to the kitchen and opened a drawer. The silverware clinked softly. She thought about how that sound used to mean dinner for 4, and now it meant dinner for 3, half the week. Co-parenting was its own war, just with rules. Mark got the kids every other week from Friday to Friday, plus a midweek dinner the opposite week. They used a shared calendar app that turned parenting into appointments. Mark would pull into the driveway, and Sarah would feel her body tense before her mind even caught up. The sound of tires on gravel, the click of a car door, the key turning in the lock, each one a small, sharp reminder. Emma started packing her backpack the night before. Dad days, arranging her favorite stuffed animal like she was preparing for deployment. Noah asked, once, "Why don't you live together anymore?" Sarah knelt in front of him and tried to make her voice steady. "Sometimes grown-ups can't be good together in the same house." Noah's brow furrowed. "But you're my mom, and he's my dad." Sarah smiled sadly. "That doesn't change." Mark tried at first to be the fun parent. Pizza nights, new toys, weekends at trampoline parks. Sarah bit her tongue every time Emma came home wired and overtired and said, "Dad said you're always mad." And Sarah wanted to scream, "Tell your dad to look in the mirror." Instead, she said, "I'm not mad at you, sweetheart." Slowly, the glamour wore off. Mark realized parenting wasn't a highlight reel. It was homework battles and baths and the quiet ache of kids asking, "Can you stay one more minute?" The first time Mark showed up late to pick them up and Sarah had to call him 3 times, she felt the old rage flare. When Mark finally arrived, he didn't apologize. He just said, "Traffic." Sarah stared at him and said softly, "It's always something with you." Mark's eyes flickered. For a second, he looked tired. Not angry, not smug. Just tired. "Yeah," he muttered, "it is." And for a moment, Sarah saw him not as her enemy, but as what he really was. A man who had confused success with safety, who had treated love like a resource that would renew itself without effort. It didn't fix anything. It just made the grief feel more complicated. Months passed. Sarah repainted the guest room Emma used to avoid because it reminded her of Dad sleeping there. Sarah bought new sheets. She rearranged the living room, not because it mattered, but because it proved she could. Sometimes, late at night, Sarah would scroll old photos and feel a pang. Weddings, newborns, that 4th of July BBQ. She'd remember the smell of charcoal and sunscreen, and the way Mark's laugh used to fill the yard. Then she'd remember the stale air of the divided house, the broken vase, the lowercase k, the contempt, and the pang would turn into something like resolve. The first 4th of July after the divorce, Sarah hosted anyway. Not to prove anything to the neighbors, not to keep up with the Joneses. Just because Emma wanted sparklers and Noah wanted hot dogs and Sarah refused to let her marriage ruin fireworks. Linda leaned over the fence. "You okay, hun?" Sarah hesitated. Then she said the truth. "Some days yes, some days no." Linda nodded, surprisingly gentle. "That's about right." Later, when the kids were asleep, Sarah sat on the porch alone with a glass of iced tea sweating in her hand. The street smelled like smoke and summer and distant laughter. Somewhere, fireworks popped like little controlled explosions. Bright, brief, harmless. Sarah thought about Mark, about Jenna, about courtrooms and calendars and the way love had turned into paperwork. She thought about that first look on campus, the way Mark had said, "I'm going to see you again," like it was fate instead of choice. She realized something that hurt and healed at the same time. There had been a step from love to hate, yes, but there had also been a step from hate to indifference, and from indifference to peace. Inside, the house was quiet, not the punishing quiet of before, but the quiet of a life that belonged to her again. Sarah listened to the hum of the fridge, the tick of the clock, the soft breathing of her children down the hall, and she let herself believe something new, not the old dream, not the white picket fantasy, something smaller, something real, a life where the door closing didn't mean abandonment, just the end of a chapter and the beginning of another.